So the more modifiers you can stack on top, the better. This is where you can get the modifiers. This is a national spirit of MIFO bills, which gives you some of these modifiers. It gives you consumer good factories, which we discussed are the actual need of the people to be taken care of by the civilian factors, So it's a number of civilian factories that get deducted from your total and are being used to take care of the needs of your own people. This number can also receive negative modifiers, which means you need less of those, which means you have more. So this is a bit counterintuitive, which means you have more civilian factories that are available to you per se. This spirit also gives you all of these bonuses, which you can read here, several plus 25% to building all kinds of stuff, right? Now the story behind it is the MIFO bills were promissory notes that were created by this dude, Hjalmar Schacht, to enable the government to fund rearmament acting through the balance sheet of the entity Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft to hide this rearmament from the French and the British eyes. So it was actually sort of like government bonds. These bills must be extended for 6 months period, or the recipients will have to be paid when they fall due. So basically, this costs you something called daily political power. It says plus 20. We're going to talk about what daily political power is in a second. So this is what is called the national spirit. Germany has 3 national spirits, 3 opening national spirits. The second one is the general staff, which gives you extra division organization planning speed and extra 25% planning speed. We will talk about all these things. Just know they're in green. They're positive modifiers. They're good. We want to stack positive modifiers wherever we can get them. Bitter loser has 2 attributes to it. One is ideology drift defense, plus 50%, which means that let's say some other country can try to influence our politics. We will be 50% harder to push away from fascism than if we didn't have this ideology. So basically, if somebody wants to boot, and this also works for us too. So basically, if I want to change the country's ideology and go communist or go democratic or go non-aligned, right? I receive a 15% penalty, although here it's in green, but it's in green only if you're fascist. I receive a 50% penalty in trying to change the ideology. We're going to discuss how you change the ideology later on. The other attribute given by us is we can create factions. We are currently in a faction. It's here, Axis. We can dismantle the faction, but I suggest that we don't do that because you need to have at least two countries come together in a faction. So automatically we have the Axis just because Paradox didn't want to have Germany wait until they can create a faction with a puppet or something, but we can technically create a faction. We can dismantle the Axis and create whatever other faction we want to do that. So these are the national spirits. There will be more added here through the focus tree. We're going to discuss that later on. The laws and the government. We have 3 main laws here that apply to every country. One of them deals with manpower, and we are right now on limited conscription. What this means is that the recruitable population factor out of our entire population is 2.5%. If you remember when we were looking at here, actually I think we were looking here, yeah. And I hovered over here, it said recruitable population is 37.98k out of 5151. So the 5151 is the maximum recruitable population, right? And 37.98 is what's been already mobilized, that is taken from the recruitable population pool and sent up here to the available manpower, the free manpower. As you can see here, well, we will still be mobilizing somewhat through once the game starts. Right now, all of these indicators aren't particularly correct. So, what other levels are available? Well, we have disarmed nation, which means 1%, volunteer only, which means 1.5, limited conscription, which is what we have, which is 2.5. And as you can see, all of these just affect the recruitable population. Now, extensive conscription gives you a jump. It basically doubles your available recruitable population from 2.5 to 5%. But you have to pay a penalty. That is, you have to pay an increase in training time. We're going to discuss what that is later on. Just know that you get more people, but you also get a negative modifier. Service by requirement is again another doubling up from 5% to 10% of recruitable population, but you're starting to stack more negative modifiers, so you get another 10% on the training time, and your factories are starting to get negative modifiers, so you don't get you get a 10% negative modifier in construction, you get a 10% less factory output, 10% less dockyard output. Why? Because it's in order to simulate that there are less people available to do the work, or let's say less qualified, as the more qualified people end up on the front lines. All adult serve is the next level, which means another doubling up. You go from 10% to 20% recruitable population, but the penalties that you have to pay are starting to be very, very bad. Minus 30% construction, minus 30% factory output, minus 30% dockyard output, and scraping the barrel, which means another 5% on top of all adult serve. So 25% is the maximum recruitable population that you can get out of your country. And the penalties that you have to pay for that are absolutely insane. So minus 40% construction speed, factory output, and dockyard output is like you are using only about half of your actual production power just to put more men in the field. So again, it's a balancing act. You want to stack as many positive modifiers, you want to avoid as many negative modifiers. Sometimes you might have no choice, like for instance, this one isn't too bad, but service by requirement is starting to impact your production capability. So it's a balancing act. This is the manpower. So Germany, as you can see here, has a total eligible core population. We're going to discuss what that means later on, of 65 million. So at most, you can get 25% of the 65 million, but at a cost that's quite significant. Now, limited exports, we've sort of covered this. It concerns how many, again, it's a balancing act. It concerns how many resources you get to keep for yourself, all right, versus all the bonuses that you could get out of the resources. Like for instance, if you have export focus, you will essentially lose another half of your resources as opposed to limited exports, right, where you only get 25% resources lost. Resource focus, you lose 50% of the resources to the market, but you get more positive modifiers in construction, research, factory output, dockyard output, and free trade. You get even more insane modifiers for just using 25% of your resources. Now, the trick is you can do a balancing act where you can go to free trade and use civilian factories to import resources, while you use the construction speed to build more civilian factories in order to compensate for the civilian factories that you are now sending away. But you end up with a factory output, a dockyard output, and a research speed net bonuses on free trade. Free trade is actually a very viable strategy for winning this game. We're going to discuss why later on. The economy law deals with two things. It deals with the reduction in consumer goods. Basically, so we have civilian economy is the weakest law. That is, you have 35% factories to consumer goods. Military to civilian and civilian to military factory conversion costs, you do not need to bother with them. You will never, ever, ever do that unless there is one strategy that might be viable. For Japan, we'll discuss it some other time. So military to civilian and civilian to military, and maybe for Germany too. We'll discuss it some other time. Right? It also says that you will gain less fuel from oil. So this minus 40% and negative, minus 25% to the fuel storage capacity. So basically the storage capacity of each fuel silo is 100,000 fuel. But there's a negative modifier stacked on top of that based on your economy law. Also, you get a negative modifier in military factory and civilian factory. So the question would be, why would anyone choose to be on civilian economy? Well, you don't choose to be on civilian economy. It's just that some other countries, democracies, start out as civilian economies. For instance, France, if we look here at the details of France, we can see some of the national spirits that they start out with, and also their laws and government. And as you can see, they start on civilian economy. Britain also starts on civilian economy. Belgium also starts on civilian economy. And for most countries, it's very hard. So we start on partial mobilization, but for most countries in the world start on civilian economy. I'm actually wondering whether even the USSR starts on civilian economy. Italy, I think, also starts on partial mobilization, and these are the only two countries, if I remember correctly, in the entire world. Maybe Japan, let me see. Japan also starts at partial mobilization, right? But the US has a different type of economy, which is even worse than civilian economy. That is undisturbed isolation, which gives even more consumer goods and all kinds of other shit. Like if you can see here, there is quite a bunch of difference here. So in short, no one wants to move to civilian economy. We almost always want to move away from it. The next level usually is early mobilization, which just sort of reduces some of the negative modifiers, but not at all. But they're not all gone. So basically, you have you have 5% less consumer good factories, right? And you get all of these nasty modifiers are gone from the conversion stuff, and the construction speed of military and civilian factories is less impacted. There's still a negative bonus, but it's less impacted. Now, in order to be able to switch to this trade law, again, for Germany, we've already moved past this economy law, We've already moved past this, but if you are playing some other nation, in order to move it, it has a certain requirement, which is more than 15% war support. You will see your war support up here. It gives certain effects. Right now, our war support is below 50%, which means we get some negative modifiers out of it. So if we can get it over 50%, we will get some better. Probably we will reduce these negative modifiers. One of them is in mobilization speed, which tells you how fast you are mobilizing to the to whatever it is that you should be mobilizing up to, which is basically, so if you change your mobilization law from here, if you go from 2.5% to 5%, you will not instantly get those people. Those people will trickle into your manpower pool in time based on the mobilization speed. This mobilization speed is shown over here. Well, actually it would be shown when if we were running the game, but you can see it here. Well, now you can't see it here. Well, when we're running the game, we'll come back and we'll revisit to actually show you this mobilization speed. The point is, war support affects this mobilization speed. It also affects your surrender limit, which is something that is entirely mysteriously calculated by Paradox. It's basically all of these cities have a certain amount of victory points, which you can see up here on the top left. So Brandenburg has 50 victory points. Actually, that was Berlin. Stettin is worth 5 victory points. Breslau is worth 10 victory points. Weimar is worth 3 victory points. Here Erfurt is worth 5 victory points. Leipzig is worth 5 victory points. Dresden is worth 5 victory points. So the idea is that the surrender limit is calculated based on how many victory points the country has in total and how many points they have lost. Very hard to keep track of that in your head. There's a certain progress bar once we're at war. It shows it in a percentage, but basically if you have less war support, the surrender limit is reduced, so you can be capitulated faster than if you had higher war support. Daily command power gain multiplier, it's this thing here. It's basically it's something that's affectionately called red telephones. It goes up per day and it's affected by war support. As you can see, we have a minus 28% modifier. You don't really need to worry about it, especially not when you're at peace. You can use the command power for certain actions. We're going to get into them later on. So we're talking about early mobilization. We discussed war support. Partial mobilization is you're already starting to get into the positive aspect of it. Now this also has a war support requirement. I think it's 25%, this is 15%, this is probably 25%, but since we have it, we don't bother with it. So again, less consumer goods, and you're starting to get positive modifiers, where here you had negative modifiers, over here you have positive modifiers. You have positive modifier to military factory construction. If you go to war economy, so these positive modifiers are actually good for they make it better for you to build military factories. You can build them faster. They only apply to military factories. So basically, if you can build as you can see here, infrastructure and dockyards, you do not get any penalties for them at all. So on civilian economy, it's a good strategy to build up your infrastructure and your dockyard. It's not a good strategy to build civilian factories unless you have to, because you are going against the 30% penalty. You need to up your economy law to at least partial mobilization, which means you need to get a war support of 25%, I think, to start building civilian factories efficiently. Now, granted, if you have no use for dockyards, and if your infrastructure is already built up to an acceptable level, then you need to start building civilian factories. It's just the thing to do. I mean, there's no point using production capacity. Yeah, even if you're building civilian factories with a 30% penalty to building them, it's still better to build them than to not build them at all, because they will help you later on, because civilian factories can be used to build more stuff. So basically, even if you build one civilian factory and it takes you 30% of the time longer, you still have one more civilian factory to unleash onto your military factory production once you can. So basically, the point is in order to build your industry, is to try to get to partial mobilization at the very least as fast as possible. War economy for fascist and communist nations is available while you are at peace, when preparing for war. For democratic nations and non-aligned nations, you are only allowed to go up to partial mobilization and switch to war economy only during wartime. Now, there is another law here, which is total mobilization. This means everything is given for the war economy. So what you need to do in order to get 50 mobilization, to get total mobilization, is you need to be at war, right? Now the actual why is this good? Because your consumer goods factories are halved. You have 20% consumer goods factories at war economy, as opposed to 25% in partial mobilization. So as you can see, from civilian to early to partial to war economy goes down by 5. And then if you go to total mobilization, the consumer goods are absolutely cut in half. You only need 10% of your factories to be dedicated to consumer goods, and this number can be further reduced by other modifiers that you can stack on top to get consumer goods factories to 0, which means everything goes to the war effort. You have to pay a price, and that is your recruitable population. You lose some of your recruitable population because basically you are mobilizing at home. So basically you're putting a lot more men. This is meant to simulate putting a lot more men into the economy rather than the army itself. But you also have you can also build military factories much faster. But the actual gain from here is consumer goods factories. You can offset this recruitable population hit by taking a decision that will be available to you once you take total mobilization, which is women in the workforce, which means that the men can go back to war, and this 3% deficit will be compensated by, I think, 2.5% if you take women in the workforce. You will take a stability hit, which we haven't discussed here yet, which is from here. Stability is how is meant to simulate how stable your nation is. Now that was and this gives you, as long as it's high, it gives you all kinds of good modifiers, right? So currently the stability is affected by plus 9% coming from the ruling party popularity, which is here at 60%. Basically, if you had 100% ruling party popularity, you'd get a plus 15 bonus in stability just from that. There are other ways to permanently boost your stability forward. We will discuss that. But what are the effects of a good stability? You get plus 6 political power gain. We're going to come back to political power gain in a minute. You get minus 3 consumer goods factories, minus 3% consumer goods factories, which is how you get this number even lower, as I was telling. So the effective number right now is not 25%, but if you remember, it's 16%, because we are getting a 5% reduction from the MIFO bills and another 3% reduction from the stabilities, and this is actually applied linearly to the 25, and we get 16 which means that our stability is giving us a little bit over 3%, and they're just rounding, and paradox is just rounding down for display purposes here. So we get minus 3% to consumer goods, and we get 13.60% factory output and 13.60% dockyard output. Now, I've mentioned factory output and dockyard output for quite a while, so this is where we get to see it. Basically, let me see. You can. I think we're going to have to imagine it because I don't think it's. Ah no, here we go. You can see it here. So we have 10 military factories, right, that are assigned here, but we have. So basically, each of the factories has a base production of 5 per day, but this is not what they're contributing. So you'd say, well, we got 10 military factories, we ought to be producing 50 units of production, right? We should be producing 50 units of production, but our production output is only 29.65 daily out of these 10 factories. Why is that? Well, because our production efficiency is only 50%. So all of a sudden, those 50 units of production get cut in half, they get snapped in half, so we're left with 25%. And on top of that, you get the production efficiency at 50%, and then you get these modifiers, 5% from limited exports, 13.6% from stability. So in effect, we have an actual production efficiency of, let me do some quick math here, of 60, although I don't think it quite works that way. I'm not sure if these things stack or not, but basically, so, and it's pointless to think about it. I mean, I'd have to get a calculator. So either we have a production efficiency of 68.6 in effect, either we have a production efficiency of 50%, and then we have a production output bonus of 18.6% applied to the 25 units of production that we're actually generating. So the stability helps you boost this production, and the production efficiency itself, you can see here, we have the production efficiency cap of the base cap for 50%, and you can improve this cap by improving your technology. So basically, you will research better technologies that will have the effect of actually filling up this bar all the way to the end. Now, there's one more thing that we can discuss while we're here. Let's say I want to add production of anti-air. When I add this production of anti-air, and I am clicking and dragging up and using the scroll button to do this, right? When I've added a factory, a military factory, to produce anti-air, all of a sudden there's this big red bar here that doesn't appear with all the other ones. Now, what does this mean? This means that when you start producing something, it starts at a base efficiency, and in our case, this base efficiency is 10%, and this base efficiency gets increased, as you can see there, by 0.247%, so almost 25% per day, until it will hit the production efficiency cap, which is 50.5%. Now you can move both the production efficiency increase per day, also the base production efficiency, and the production efficiency cap. You can increase all of these through technologies. we can discuss this. So basically what happens is when you add a factory in that is not used, and you can observe this when I add, let's say I add a new factory to the artillery, and let's say we let this thing run for an hour, or maybe it needs to run for a full day. Or maybe it doesn't affect newly added factories. Let's see. I'm just going to wait until we get to January 2nd, just to see if this thing changes at all. Well, it did change a bit. So if I am to add one more and one more and one more, you'll see the production did go down quite a bit, but because we were at full production for so long, the efficiency cap was yeah, it was up. So these factories aren't producing as good as this factory, but basically by it doesn't affect it to a similar degree. So this one goes to 10%, right? Here it doesn't really work that way. It is intuitive. So basically, intuitively, but I think this is only something that happens at the very beginning. So what I'm doing here is I have 28 factories to assign. I'm just going to assign them all. And what you can do further on is you can assign some ghost factories. And basically what this means is, by the way, I don't want to build tactical bomber. So here's something. I've assigned three factories here, but I don't have these factories. But what happens is when I build factories, or when I reassign some or when I remove some factories from other areas, these will be filled up first, and this is filled in a top to bottom fashion. So basically, if I put one factory here that's empty, right, it will assign, by removing this factory, it will be assigned here. But if I don't have it here, they will be assigned here. So they just try to fill up. This is a good way to sort of set up your priorities. So I'm clearing this production line, and all of a sudden you're going to see another factory pop up here. Boom, there it is. Okay.